Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America. Thank you for joining us on the program. Website thisweekinamerica.us. As mentioned, our special guest back on the program is Dr. Frank Davis III. He's a retired general surgeon. He received his AB in chemistry, his MD in medicine from UNC Chapel Hill. He's a retired member of the American College of Surgeons, the Southeastern Surgical Association, and the American Association for the Surgery of Trauma. He was inspired to write one of his books, What's Your Analysis, Diagnosis, Truth or Fantasy? An Essay on Human Perception, because of his recognition that narcissism is both painful and self-defeating. Another book we've discussed on the program, The Nature of Science Today, Denial of the Truth Forms as Reality. And back with us on the program, and a lot of interesting discussion coming up on today's program with Dr. Frank Davis III. Dr. Davis, welcome back to the program. It's great to have you with us.
Good to be with you, Rick.
It is always an interesting conversation, and I'm ready to go. Teach me something today, because you always do at the end of the half hour. What we're talking about and what you've really looked into, you've addressed and been able to resolve are two questions that really have been around, great intellectual challenges that have been around for a number of years by Sigmund Freud and Albert Einstein. Talk about the two challenges, and then we'll get into each one individually.
Well, the challenge of Sigmund Freud was to solve the problem of structural development of the personality. And Freud actually did this himself, probably without realizing it. But, in order to do this, you have to understand the problem of narcissism, because Freud believed that this problem of structural development of personality would come from a better understanding of narcissism. So he actually showed in his earliest paper that the personality of 18 females who had the hysterical personality disorder was caused by elements in their environment. Usually their fathers or their older brothers had transferred to these young women a core value system of looking at themselves as sexual objects rather than a more complete personality. So that the whole focus of the hysterical female came to be upon that of sexuality. And to understand it in terms of narcissism, the focus of personality is upon the fantasy world, the specific fantasy world of the individual that has narcissism. For example, their fantasy world might be related to the idea of them having unlimited wealth as the solution to all of their problems, or unsurpassed intelligence, or unsurpassed beauty. And there are 6 fantasy worlds listed by the American Psychiatric Association in the diagnostic criteria of this disorder, the narcissistic personality disorder. And those 6 fantasy worlds are the fantasy of unlimited wealth, the fantasy of unsurpassed brilliance, the fantasy of ideal love, which is the fantasy of having love from someone else without the feeling of necessity to return that love or exhibit similar love in return to get it. The fantasy of unlimited power, and what is that, 4?
That, I believe we're up to 4.
There's 2 more listed by the American Psychiatric Association. Association in their diagnostic criteria.
How accurate is their definitions, their criteria? Have they done a good job in formulating this?
I think they've done an exceptional job in formulating this, and it is extending the accuracy of diagnosis for all persons caring for psychiatric patients, and of course, making the diagnoses consistent among the different practitioners. If you recognize that they must use these criteria that are in the diagnoses in order to make the diagnosis. But of course, there will be disagreement among various caregivers
Yes.
about whether these diagnoses are as effective as I might think they are. Partly because, for example, the immediate past president, or one of the recent past presidents of the International Association of Psychoanalysts, said that these diagnostic criteria are ignoring the person with the disorder. But see, what that person wants to do is he is unconsciously exhibiting his wish to express his unconscious knowledge, and I put knowledge in quotes there because it's false knowledge, that the personality is an endogenous or genetic character rather than an environmentally acquired character that relates to the parental value system. And this is the way Sigmund Freud originally wrote this up for the hysterical personality disorder. And he does it more generally in his discussion of personality structures such as the superego and the ego. My writings have concluded that the superego of the person, as defined by Freud, is really a person's soul as recognized in Christianity, and the ego of a person is really his spirit as recognized in Christian literature. So that Freud had terms separate from the religious terms for structures in the mind that correlate to structures said to be accessible only in religious terms from God. In that, the Bible says that these understandings come from God Himself.
Yes.
And they are rather almost intangible to describe how you acquire these understandings. But if, for example, a person were to have a spouse that had the fantasy worldview of unlimited wealth, he might be able to answer questions about his spouse with this understanding that he otherwise would not have. And he also would be able to understand this fact that the psychoanalysts say that humanity has never been very careful about identifying exactly what the truth is, so that humanity seems at many times to be disoriented as to what the truth is. And while the psychoanalysts have that as one of their objectives to understand that, they seem unable to recognize that this disorientation or this personality disorder of not understanding these things is caused by feelings of entitlement, for example, to feel that they have brilliance that is not equaled or unsurpassed by anybody else.
It's fascinating revelations. You're listening to This Week in America. Our website is thisweekinamerica.us. Our guest on the program once again is Dr. Frank Davis III, a retired general surgeon. We're talking about several of his books and concepts, intellectual challenges that he's addressed and resolved over the course of years of study. The books are available at several websites, DoranceBookstore.com, that's DoranceBookstore.com, as well as UnifiedFieldEquation.com. You can go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and link on directly to Dr. Davis's book information. And again, the time always goes by so quickly when we're talking. And you mentioned something before about psychoanalysis, and I find this interesting. Talk about the conflict in psychoanalysis between the genetic and environmental causation, and why this is a concern.
Well, if there's an assumption, even an unconscious assumption, that personality is caused by genetics rather than the environment, the tendency for the analyst is to ignore environmental causation and simply attribute all cause of personality to genetics. And of course, the findings of Freud are contrary to that, as are my findings, where I have identified the fantasy worlds of the narcissistic personality disorders as the superego structures for those personalities. What I mean to say there is that the parental way of looking at at life and the worldview is in those fantasy worlds for people that acquire those disorders. So if you understand the fantasy worlds clearly enough, you understand that the fantasy worlds cause the disordered perceptions that occur in persons with those disorders. And so that if you, to state how you recognize that this is a superego disorder, is suppose you had a patient who had the narcissistic personality disorder with a fantasy of unlimited wealth, and she or he would have trouble with his spouse because of the poor management of money. Then if the person then noticed among their children that the child's identity, core identity and core self was that fantasy worldview, they could then recognize that two generations successively had disorders in their personality because of that fantasy worldview of life and relationships in general, or in particular.
Yeah, so there really is a real world application to what you've been able to establish. And it's interesting that I mentioned the two great intellectual challenges, both coming back in 1905. We're talking, in this case, the structural development of personality. And also, before the time is gone, I want to touch on Albert Einstein and the great challenge that he had. Talk about the unified field theory and what you were able to find out about this.
Well, both Einstein and Freud set up a great challenge for the world, intellectual challenge, in 1905, where Freud suggested that somebody would one day solve the structural development of personality by solving its relationship to the problem of narcissism. Albert Einstein in 1905, same year, suggested that it would one day be possible to write a single equation that would unify the three theories of physics. The three theories of physics being that of electromagnetism, gravity, and Coulomb's law of forces of attraction related to charges. And to solve the problem of Einstein, you merely have to recognize that Einstein tried to define, because of his wish to use calculus in his expressions, he tried to define the particle of energy in many ways rather than one single way. So that if you recognize that a particle is an element or an elemental entity, like the unit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then you realize that to name the particle of energy as Planck's constant times the frequency of light, for example, defines the particle of energy in so many different ways that you can't work with it anymore, except to predict maybe, for example, the color of light that you're receiving when you receive a certain light signal of a certain frequency. And of course, that frequency association was useful to physics in terms of understanding light, which was Einstein's favorite subject, but it actually led to his disorientation as to solving his unified field theory. Now, the unified field theory is solved mathematically using a single particle of light as the energy of light consistent with Planck's constant without regard to time. So that actually what Einstein got his Nobel Prize for was the work that disabled his ability to solve the unified field. And I find that extremely interesting because
yes, if I heard that correctly, yes, that is interesting. I didn't realize that.
You almost have to turn around the history of the Nobel Prize and its value relative to Einstein in order to solve the problem. The greatest problem that Einstein left for us is the unified field and its mathematical solution. But once you have that unified field theory particle of energy equal to Planck's constant without regard to time, you can then come up with a particle of mass. And you understand that the particles of energy are the physical things that make up the force of gravity and the force of coulombs, and they have as a unifying factor an exactly similar particle size. Then, of course, when you come up with the particle of mass for that, you can calculate or see that mass, energy, and the three theories of physics are consistent with each other and therefore can be made equalities of each other. And therefore you have then constructed an equation that is proven by the literature and is accurate.
You know, time goes by so quickly. It is always a fascinating conversation. Let's take the unified field theory. How long did you work on this and coming up with a solution? I mean, here are these great challenges that have been there for years, and you were able to come up with solutions to both. Unified field theory, how long did you work on this?
Well, it was almost automatic once the structural development of personality was solved, in that I realized that Albert Einstein had narcissism with the fantasy world of unsurpassed brilliance. And I realized that he would both over-idealize and devalue the subject of his main concern, which would be his understanding of light energy, light as energy. If you multiply the particle of energy of light by a frequency, you get a much larger amount of energy than you have if you just say the particle of energy is equal to Planck's constant, simply expressed in terms of energy without regard to time. And you realize that the particle of energy is a unique particle size for all frequencies of light, since it's the frequency times Planck's constant is the amount of energy per second. for light.
Right.
And so you realize that Einstein had the narcissistic personality disorder. He had the typical characteristic of it of over-idealizing his object light, and he grossly over-idealized the particle size for the quantity or the unit particle of energy. So that once you solve the problem of personality, you solve the problem of the other problems of science, in that you look for over-idealization and devaluation in the focus of the person's interest.
It is always fascinating. I'm going to take another 30 seconds here. In talking about personality issues, what led you to even look into that? You're a noted surgeon, a very successful career. What interested you in pursuing this?
Well, of course, it would be people that I had very intense relationships with, and people that I would prefer not to identify by name, or even by relationship, but much more close relationships than, for example, maybe even a psychoanalyst with his patients. Because this is not an association that's been made before. In fact, it's been denied for over a century, 110 years. It's been denied. For example, the cause of hysteria as a parent exhibiting a singular interest in a female child as to her sexuality, that has not been recognized as true in psychoanalysis, despite the fact that Freud wrote a paper on 18 hysterical patients that he cured with psychoanalysis, that demonstrated to him that the cause of their hysteria was either rape or by their fathers or
Right.
their oldest brother, or suggestion of that value for the female person, as opposed to all the other many values that she could have to her father and or older brother.
Right. It is always an interesting discussion, and has been this time. Our guest on This Week in America is Dr. Frank Davis III, a retired general surgeon, author of several books, including What's Your Analysis Diagnosis? Truth or Fantasy, an essay on human perception. And the second book we've talked about in the program, The Nature of Science Today, Denial of the Truth Forms as Reality. The books are available at DoranceBookstore.com, as well as UnifiedFieldEquation.com. That's an excellent website, and you should check that out, UnifiedFieldEquation.com. And if you can't remember all of that and you're traveling, just go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and link on directly to those websites to get information on Dr. Davis and information on the books as well. Dr. Davis, it is always a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you so much for being with us once again.
Great to be with you, Rick.
Thank you. You're listening to This Week in America, our website with all the information on our guest on today's program, Dr. Frank Davis III. All that information at our website, thisweekinamerica.us.